Hi, I'm Stephen Larson, and this is once again the Acoustic Words Reading Room. If you've been here before, welcome back. If this is your first visit, thank you for coming by. The entire idea behind this Acoustic Words Reading Room is to give you about a half an hour of escape from life through one or more of my short stories or a poem. And let me get the shameless self plug out of the way first. All of my short stories are available individually if you would like to keep a copy for yourself. They're available individually as electronic downloads, $1.99 a piece. The entire collection of short stories, plus the poetry and illustrations, are as well as commentary on all the pieces. That is either available as an electronic download for $7.99 or as a hardcover book for $9.99. It's called Acoustic Words: The Collected Short Works by Stephen M. Larson. By the way, you do not get the Doctor Who bookmark. That is mine. You're on your own for that. In this edition of the Reading Room, I'm going to start with a piece that comes from the Chronicles of Stewart Lambert. Now, that actually, I do intend eventually to have an entire series of stories based on the character Stewart Lambert. And each of these stories uses one or more incidents of my own life as a launching place to spin into the fiction itself. This particular story uses two incidents, and right now it is the only story featuring Stewart Lambert. I'm hoping one of these days, like I said, to do an entire series. This is Of Dogs and Consequences, from the Chronicles of Stewart Lambert. In a way, Stewart Lambert's friendship with Curtis Washington began almost a quarter century before they met. Stewart was still in high school and still going by Stew when he, Matt Lippman, and Jim Salowitz decided to spend a September Saturday walking the Illinois prairie path from Glen Ellen to Aurora, a distance of some 20 miles. They met on the crushed limestone trail at 6:30 on a cool, clear morning. The sun was just rising, tinting a couple of stray clouds on an otherwise pale pearl blue sky with careless brushstrokes of pink and orange. They started out at a brisk pace down the former Chicago, Aurora, and Elgin Railroad right-of-way, with their lunches in their backpacks and their canteens on their belts, the sun at their backs, and a breeze in their faces. Chicago's urban landscapes had not yet overrun the suburbs in 1968, so once they had crossed the Wheaton city limits, the three friends soon found themselves in unincorporated areas with plenty of fields, meadows, woods, and streams. Southwest of Warrenville, they even encountered open farmland. And here is where it happened. Stu never really knew where the dog came from. He would joke later that it was probably a farm dog that had become bored playing solitaire and smoking cigarettes behind the shed. So when three teenaged boys, seeing Steppenwolf's Born to be Wild, appeared at the far end of the soybean field, the dog decided this threat needed to be met swiftly and decisively. Thus, just as Stu, Matt, and Jim were bellowing, "Like a true nature's child, we were born to be wild," a dirty yellow blur burst from the beans. They were too startled to run, too startled even to look at each other. For one stuttering heartbeat, each imagined teeth at his throat. Then, more from fear than from anything else, Stu opened his mouth and roared. A rich, full-throated, stentorian blast of anger and terror. It was possibly the only thing that could take his friends' minds off their own imminent disembowelment. It was also the only thing the dog hadn't expected. Faced with this sudden development, he tried desperately to backpedal. Instead, his paws slid out from under him as he hit the limestone chips at the edge of the path, and he tumbled and rolled and cartwheeled clear across the trail and into a patch of burdock on the other side. With a yelp, he regained his footing. Shying away from these strange creatures, his hide stinging from a dozen scrapes and scratches and mottled with burrs, he limped as quickly as he could back across the trail and into the safety of his soybeans. The rest of the hike was anticlimactic. Matt and Jim hailed Stu as a hero, and Stu nursed a sore throat for the next 3 days. And until they graduated and went their separate collegiate ways, the three joked about the day Stu saved them from the attack of the barnyard dog. Some 24 years and 2,100 miles later, Stewart Lambert was enjoying the soft air of another September morning, this one in Berkeley, California. A long way from his high school buddies and his high school dreams, Stewart was married with a son and a daughter in high school themselves and a small, successful business. Lately, however, his surfer blonde hair was beginning to show hints of silver in certain lights, and his wiry, athletic frame to pick up a little excess flesh around the middle, so he had added a morning jog to his routine. On this particular morning, Stewart was taking advantage of his new habit to explore one of the older Berkeley neighborhoods. The sun was coloring the upper floors of the tall brownstones and filtering through the dense leaves of the old oaks and maples as he turned up an alley and found himself on a single lane of worn pavement through which the original paving bricks peeped at intervals, jogging between two lines of wooden fences encasing small, neat yards. He slowed to a walk, using this break from the traffic to take a bit of a breather. The street noise faded behind him, and he could hear snatches of birdsong. He was listening intently to the gentle cooing of a mourning dove, when a cacophony of barks, growls, and snarls erupted almost at his elbow. A few deep breaths restored his heart to its proper pace, and Stewart cautiously peeped over the saw-toothed top of the quivering old fence. A young pit bull was dashing itself against the rotting boards, trying his best to get at the juicy leg it just knew was waiting on the other side. Stewart smiled and woofed quietly. The dog looked up, startled, and then decided to try to launch itself over the fence. At this point, Stewart decided that not only was discretion the better part of valor, but retreat was the better part of survival. He quickly backed away and continued walking down the alley, leaving the dog to its own schemes. About 3 houses further along, the vocalizations of the pit bull were joined by another, more terrifying sound, the splintering of wood. He glanced back. The dog had found a weak spot in the fence and was forcing its way through. Stewart looked around, suddenly anxious. The end of the alley was still far away, and the lines of fences on the sides seemed unbroken. He wondered if he could outrun a pit bull, but before he could even turn, the last splinter of fence gave way, and the dog shot out. Stewart stared as madness on 4 paws bulleted toward him. Something about the situation seemed naggingly familiar. Instinctively, he opened his mouth, took a deep breath, and roared. It worked. For one brief moment, it actually worked. The dog skidded to a halt some 20 feet away and stared at him. Then it showed its teeth and rumbled deep in its chest, and Stewart knew he was dead. There was no time to plan, only to act. Stewart whirled and grabbed at the top of the wooden fence behind him. He swung his legs up in a move he had no idea he could execute. He thought he could feel hot, moist breath on his lower ankle. Then he was over the fence and sprawling on a small, newborn compost heap. He was on his feet almost without pause, feeling deep satisfaction at having bested so formidable an opponent. The dog raged at him from the alley as Stewart strutted back and forth along the other side of the barrier, chanting, "Who the man? Who the man?" "I assume you the man?" Stewart stopped in mid-strut and slowly turned. The voice was soft, yet powerful enough to carry over the frantic ravening of the pit bull, and bore such an imprint of culture and dignity that he was totally unprepared for a tall black man with silver hair and a football player's build dressed in boxers and undershirt and carrying a plastic garbage bag. Stewart was aware of a sudden silence as the dog stopped barking. He stared at the homeowner, and images of Rodney King and last spring's race riots in Los Angeles leapt to his mind. He licked suddenly dry lips and searched for his voice. He found a pale imitation of it somewhere and stammered, I'm sorry, I didn't, I mean, I, he gestured at the fence. He looked wildly about for a gate that would allow him access to the street in front of the house. There was none. The man guessed correctly what Stewart was seeking. I'm afraid we have no gate, he said gravely, and I don't think little Caesar will permit you to leave over the fence. You'll have to come through the house. Oh, I couldn't, Stewart blurted. Well, I suppose I could try to convince little Caesar to leave you alone. The man placed the bag in a bin next to his door. However, even he won't listen to me. Come, he added as Stewart still hesitated. Unlike Caesar, I won't bite. All right. Stewart paused to brush grass clippings and bits of orange peel from his clothing. Then he straightened and walked to where the other man waited for him. As he approached, he suddenly thrust out his hand. My name's Stewart Lambert, he said. The man had a powerful grip. Washington. Curtis Washington. They gazed at one another for a long moment. Then simultaneously, they both burst out laughing. Come, Curtis chuckled. Have a cup of coffee with me before you leave. I couldn't, Stewart protested again. Oh, please, it wouldn't be any imposition. Unless, of course, you have to be at work soon. Well, actually, Stewart admitted, I run my own business, and my staff, all two of them, probably wouldn't miss me for an hour or so. Excellent! Curtis led him into the kitchen, where a pot of coffee was already steaming. So what do you do? I design websites. Stewart described his business as he sat at the kitchen table. Then Curtis explained that he was Professor Emeritus of English Literature and Creative Writing at the Berkeley campus of the University of California, and that he had been retired now for 2 years. They were still talking an hour later when Dinah Washington, Curtis's wife, came into the kitchen to make breakfast. She seemed to find nothing at all unusual about her husband sitting in his underwear, expressing his frustrations with the grammatical irregularities of professional websites to a stranger in a jogging outfit. In fact, she reassured Stewart as she cracked eggs and buttered bread with the deft assurance of a short-order cook, she had long since grown accustomed to coming downstairs at all hours to find any number of young writers and poets in deep discussion with her husband. And, she added, she had fixed her share of impromptu breakfasts. Stewart left much later than he'd planned after sharing lunch with both Dr. and Mrs. Washington. From then on, he made a point of jogging past the Washington house for coffee with Curtis at least once a week. He even went out of his way to make up with little Caesar, and soon he and the dog, and little Caesar's owners, were also good friends. The Washingtons became frequent guests in the Lambert home as well. Dr. Washington became unofficial tutor to both Greg Lambert, who would eventually become an English teacher himself, and Chris Lambert, who would ultimately become a journalist. Stewart invited Curtis to become a consultant with Lambert Net Designs. As a result, Stewart's websites became models of literacy as well as creativity, and were soon winning awards and attracting new business. Grateful though he was for the Washingtons' friendship, Stewart often wondered why Dr. Curtis Washington spent so much time with someone like him. But it wasn't until last year, after Curtis died in his sleep, that he finally asked Dinah about it. Oh, Stewart, she replied in her soft, low voice, I thought you knew. She led him to a pair of upholstered armchairs in a quiet corner of the funeral home. They sat in silence while she gathered her thoughts, and Stewart leaned forward and took her hand. She looked up at him and smiled, covering his hand with her other one. When Curtis first retired, she began, a number of his students came by regularly to visit with him and pick his brains. He looked so forward to those times. After he'd been away from the university for about a year, though, the visits tapered off. Most of them had been seniors, and they graduated, and the others, well, I guess they decided they were too busy to keep an old man company. He didn't say much, but I could tell how much he missed them. And I think he started slowly dying. He'd had a heart condition for years. You knew that, didn't you? Stewart nodded. Well, Dinah continued, He'd fought that condition with everything in him because he so loved teaching his students. But when they stopped coming around, he stopped fighting. Then you showed up, a younger man willing to spend some time with him. And I saw the light come back into his eyes for the first time in a year. Then you invited him to help you with your business and your kids. Do you have any idea how much he loved helping them? Oh, he'd seen many of his students go on to become writers and teachers, but I think seeing his influence on your kids meant more to him than all of them put together. Dinah gripped Stuart's hand in both of hers, and her eyes and her smile both shimmered. Stuart, honey, you kept my husband alive. I would have lost him 10 years ago if it hadn't been for you. You want to know what he got out of your friendship? He got life, honey. He got love. He got a reason to keep going. Stuart was dumbfounded. He'd never known any of this, never even dreamed it. When Dinah got up to visit with a cousin from Atlanta, Stuart stayed where he was, feeling both proud and humble. In the months since Dr. Curtis Washington passed away, Stuart and his wife have continued to visit Dinah on a regular basis, and she's remained a vital part of their family. And whenever Stuart visits on the old brownstone, he makes a point of stopping in the alley to greet a crippled, arthritic old pit bull named Little Caesar. That was Of Dogs and Consequences. I suppose it's not, I don't know whether it's nice, whether it's good for a writer to be emotionally overwhelmed by his own words, but I do that every time I read that. The second story I'd like to read for you is from what I call the Speculative Fiction and Fantasy collection. It's actually a spiritual allegory, and it is one of the very small handful of works that I have that is overtly Christian. This is, I'll show you, this is the illustration that I created to go with it. And the story is called The Soul Eaters, an Allegory. 1. She came to me in a dream. I'd never seen her before, but I knew her immediately. I was certain it was her indescribable beauty that unsettled me when I looked upon her. She reached for me with a smile of welcome recognition, and I knew that we had been lovers for a long time. But she stopped before I could embrace her, fear and revulsion marring her exotic features. She looked beyond me, and I suddenly knew, without turning, who stood at my shoulder. She is lovely, isn't she? He asked. She is, I replied cautiously, for his voice was cool and faintly ironic. You don't think so? He asked. I hesitated and then asked, why does she fear you? Because I can see her. But I see her too, yet she doesn't fear me. Oh, you only see her appearance. I see her truly. I dreaded what might happen, but my curiosity drove me to ask, well, how can I truly see her? You can't. But, well, not with your own eyes. Look at her with my eyes. I was going to ask how I could do that, when I felt something like the wings of a dove brush my eyelids. I blinked. The light grew brighter. The colors around me became almost dazzling. I looked eagerly at her, then recoiled, sick and afraid. Well, she was still beautiful, but her beauty was somehow twisted and tainted, a perfect piece of fruit rotting beneath the skin. What happened to her? I gasped. Oh, nothing, he replied gently. That is how she has always been. I remembered the many times I'd held her to my heart and cried, how could I be so stupid? His voice was sad. You're not alone. See? I looked and saw many other men and women around me, each with a beautiful or handsome lover, each of the lovers with the same defiled glory of the creature before me. I turned away, but he stopped me. Look, he urged. I hesitated, and then did as he'd commanded, and nearly fainted. For I saw my brothers and sisters embracing these creatures even as I had done, and I saw the creatures attacking them with a horrifying savagery. Their delicate fingers or strong sculpted hands were now talons that ripped open flesh and bone and tore the living hearts from their victims. Their lips and cheeks were red, not with a blush of love, but with dripping blood. Their cries were not those of lovers in rapture, but of animals in the frenzy of their feeding. Yet their victims, far from writhing in agony, seemed scarcely to notice. Some, perhaps, looked a little uncomfortable, but most welcomed this butchery. And then I was further amazed, for each of the creatures finished its grisly feast and turned away, sated, leaving its victim seemingly untouched. Most victims simply walked away. Some with smiles that seemed satisfied, yet rang hollow, some with troubled faces as though uncertain of what had happened. A few bled slowly or wept, but even they seemed to recover after a while. I looked back at the creature I had loved. It glared at me and my companion, and I suddenly saw the flecks of dried blood at the corners of its cruel, beautiful lips, and beneath its immaculately manicured, razor-sharp nails. And I realized that what I'd just seen had happened also to me. Not once, but many times. "How?" I cried. "How can any of us still be alive?" What you've seen," he whispered, "happens not in your flesh, but in your spirit. It is not your physical heart that this creature devours, but the heart that I have given you. And it is not the blood in your veins that stains its mouth and claws, but your soul." "What is this foul creature?" I backed away from it, shuddering. "Well, you have seldom thought it foul." "What? How could anyone think anything else?" "Oh, but you have only now begun to truly see it. Indeed, you still see beauty in it. You've embraced it, and others like it, often, some nearly every day." And suddenly I understood what this creature was, and I was ashamed, for I'd welcomed it eagerly into my own life. Indeed, if it stayed too long away from me, I'd willingly sought it. The horror of what I'd done jolted me awake, and I swore as I lay in the dark never to have anything more to do with the beast. 2. I don't know how many nights passed when he once again came to me. I welcomed him, and I showed him how I'd locked the creature away in a deep cell. I waited for his approval, but he merely said, "Come." And suddenly we were in a place like a dungeon, with cells beyond numbering. Though each was blocked by a heavy stone door, I could see in each cell one of the creatures, chained to the wall. "Are all of these mine?" I asked, trembling. "No," he said. "Watch." I turned and saw other men and women, like myself, descending the steps into the dungeon. Some bore creatures that squirmed and bit as they were thrown into empty cells and locked away. Many more, however, came empty-handed. Some of these came and peered into the cells and turned away with expressions of revulsion, or regret, or even longing. Others came and looked for a while, then slowly unlocked the cells and entered and joined with the creatures. I was horrified, but then I looked again at the creatures and suddenly saw them as their jailers did. Some retained a foul air. These the men and women approached with trembling and loathing, even as they embraced them. Others, however, had resumed their beauty, if only for a short while. Then I saw them again as they truly were, and watched as the creatures once again feasted on the spirits of the jailers, and I knew that the creatures were almost as much captors as captives. And when it was over, many of the men and women left with tears of self-loathing, but some left with dry eyes and neglected to lock the chains and doors, and the creatures soon followed them and left the cells empty. And then he brought me back to the cell I had created, and I knew that what I'd seen in the dungeon had happened here as well, for the walls and floor were stained with red. And I fell to my knees and wept for the utter futility of my efforts, for I knew I would never be strong enough to keep my creatures locked safely away. 3. Last night I saw her again. I stood at the open door of the cell, trembling and sweating. I saw no sign of the creature in her, only ravishing beauty, bound with chains, pleading silently for release. I clung to the door, knowing what she was, yet desiring her, aware that if I released her, I would forever be her captive. I can help you. I'd been so engulfed in my own struggle that I hadn't even felt his approach. Yes, I whispered, help me. In an instant, the cell vanished, and she stood free, watching us warily. What have you done? I cried. My walls, my chains are gone. They were but illusions, he explained gently, with only temporary power. Then give me permanent walls and chains. Well, that would solve nothing. Then how am I to stand against her? Look behind you. I turned and saw a woman dressed in mail, with a sword by her side. I thought she'd been sent to slay my creature for me, but she didn't see me. She warily watched a man of incredible beauty and strength approach, and I realized that she, like me, had her own creatures. But instead of locking him away, she drew her sword. He bared his teeth, and they were like fangs. He raised his hands, and his claws were long and sharp. He threw himself at her, but she blocked him with her shield. She was still learning to use her weapons. Many of his blows eluded her defenses, but most merely glanced off her helmet and breastplate. She seemed to have forgotten her sword, but then she began to wield it, and though her blows were slow and clumsy, her attacker fell back in terror. He seemed to fear even the slightest approach of that bright blade. Then one of her blows finally landed. I thought it would do little more than scratch him, but where it touched his unholy flesh, light flashed and consumed him, leaving only his unearthly shriek ringing in the air. That is how to fight the creatures that would devour your spirit, my companion murmured to me. But I have no weapons, I protested, no armor. You have what I've given you, he replied. I looked down at myself, astounded, for I was indeed clothed in armor, with a shield on my left arm and a sword on my left hip. But, I said, I don't know how to use these things. Just use them, he urged, and don't worry about your skill, for the more you use them, the better you'll be. I touched the hilt of the sword. Will this destroy them forever? Some creatures it will, others will return, but never give in. Fight the good fight, and when you are wounded, or when your adversary wins a battle, don't hide your wounds from me. Come, and I will heal you and prepare you for your next battle. And if you persevere, someday I will win the war, and your battles will be done. Now, go. Be courageous, for I fight at your side, though you may not feel me or see me. And remember, the victory is mine. I turned to face my enemy, but before I could draw my sword, the dream had ended. Yet I know who she is, and I know my other enemies, and I know they will come to me in the day, disguised in many ways. And I know now that I have armor and a weapon, though I may not see them, and that I have a commander who will never abandon me on the field of battle. That was once again the Soul Eaters. If you would like a little more information on the armor and the sword that I used metaphorically in that, go to the Bible, and in the book of Ephesians, chapter 6, verses 10 through 17, it describes in more depth the armor and the sword. Thank you for visiting. Thank you for listening. As usual, if you really liked the stories, go ahead and put a like on here on the story. Put a like here and subscribe if you wish. If you didn't like the stories, by all means, share them with an enemy. Let them suffer. Otherwise, go ahead and share it with your friends. And keep coming back and looking for further stories and poems. And you can also go to my website, which is www.stephenmlarson.com, and that's how you spell Stephen M. Larson. But all one word, basically, StephenMLarson.com. It's got links to all of the stories. It's got links to novels that I've written. It has links to music that I have created that you can listen to on SoundCloud. Um, and it's got a way that you can contact me. It also has a link to my Facebook Acoustic Words page. So thank you, and I hope to see you again.